I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
The 1960s were a decade characterized by rising tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. These tensions came to a head in 1961 when President John F. Kennedy issued a challenge that would culminate in the achievement of one of the nation's greatest accomplishments to date, the launch of Apollo 11.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Throughout the course of human history, mankind has been intent on unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos. This captivation provoked nations around the world to become interested in unraveling the secrets of space. During the 1950s and 60s, the US and the USSR became the leading powers in developing technology that would make space exploration possible.
At the end of World War II, a race developed between the Soviet Union and the United States to capture German Vengeance Weapon II rocket technology and develop it for their own efforts. The V-2s, which were the world's first long-range combat ballistic missiles, were mass-produced during World War II in Germany's Mittelwerk-Dora concentration camps. The competition over this technology ignited the space race, a battle for supremacy in space exploration between the two nations.
The space race took off on October 4, 1957, with the launching of Sputnik 1 by the USSR. 1 month later, Sputnik 2 was launched, which put the first living creature in space. The United States responded with the launch of the satellite Explorer 1 the next year, followed shortly by the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. There were also extensive reforms in the nation's secondary science and math programs following the passage of the National Defense Education Act by President Eisenhower. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Americans were beginning to feel inadequate and outdone by their Soviet counterparts. As author John Babor stated, the United States could not be second in the eyes of the world, because second was last.
It was at this pivotal moment that President John F. Kennedy addressed the American people with a speech that would alter the future of America's social, economic, and technological standing in the world.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Despite the tragic assassination of JFK in November of 1963, America refused to give up on his dream of reaching the moon. It was this determination which gave new life to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
The first major initiative of the lunar landing project was Project Gemini. The Gemini program, which began in December of 1961, emphasized the development of technology that would be used by the astronauts in the Apollo program. Flights of the Apollo spacecrafts began in the late 1960s.
Despite the tragic failure of Apollo 1 in January of 1967, the program experienced successes with later Apollo missions. On Thursday, January 9, 1969, NASA released the news that Apollo 11 would be the first attempt at landing a man on the moon in mid-July or August. The astronauts chosen for the mission, Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, spent several months undergoing rigorous physical training as well as becoming familiar with the objectives of their mission and preparing for anything that could go wrong.
While the astronauts were preparing for their big day, the rest of the country was waiting with bated breath. There was the constant threat that the Soviets could beat us to the moon. However, their last attempt failed on July 4th, and 12 days later, America launched Apollo 11.
Cape Kennedy was alive with excitement by 3 a.m. on July 16th. About 1 million people camped out on the beaches and roads surrounding Launchpad 39A to watch the launching of Apollo 11. With 1/5 of the world's population, more than 600 million people watching and listening, this was the perfect opportunity to prove the superiority of democracy over communism to the world. At exactly 9:32 a.m. on July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 spacecraft had liftoff.
The $25.4 billion Apollo 11 spacecraft was 30 stories tall, contained about 6 million parts, and was attached to a Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V was developed by Werner von Braun, stood 363 feet tall, and its fuel energy was equivalent to a small atomic bomb.
On July 19, 1969, Apollo 11 reached lunar orbit. During its descent to the surface, the fuel tanks were running low. With just 20 seconds of fuel left, the craft landed safely, and Mission Control heard the famous words.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
7 hours later, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the Eagle and began his descent down the ladder. As his foot touched the moon's surface for the first time, he spoke the words that would be known by all future generations.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Aldrin followed shortly after, and the two astronauts began their assigned objectives. Their first task was to immediately take a sample of the lunar soil in case they had to abort the mission. They then conducted maneuverability tests by jogging away from the lunar module. Next, Aldrin set up a solar wind collector and a passive seismometer which would detect moonquakes. Their final task on the moon was one of the most iconic moments of this mission, planting an American flag on the lunar surface.
4 hours later, the Columbia and Eagle rejoined. With their mission accomplished, Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong had to return home safely. 3 days later, July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 made its splashdown into the Pacific Ocean. Awaiting their arrival was the aircraft carrier, the Hornet, with President Nixon on board. The astronauts were quarantined in an aluminum trailer for 20 days. Standing outside their trailer, Nixon told the men, "For one priceless moment, in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one."
Apollo 11 was a great accomplishment that heightened the national pride of many Americans. However, what is looked at as one of the greatest moments in world history did not come without conflict. Gil Scott-Heron saw the moon landing as a symbol of America's racial inequalities, prompting him to write the song Whitey on the Moon. Conspiracies also surrounded the lunar landing. Some people thought the program was a hoax and the astronauts never landed on the moon. Public interest quickly lessened after the mission, as the majority of people could not relate to or understand the mechanics of the missions as they were published. The war in Vietnam also provided a distraction, as Americans were more concerned with the troops overseas than the actions of the scientific community. However, interest in the Apollo missions was renewed in the 1990s with the movie Apollo 13.
The lunar landing of 1969 made many important changes in our society. It provided the world with a new awareness of Earth and its place in the universe. The mission also showed what a determined and dedicated group of people could accomplish.
In the years surrounding the Apollo mission, communities located in the Rural Crescent experienced economic growth following the establishment of factories in the region that produced parts for the spacecraft. The Apollo program also improved the quality of education in these communities following an influx of scientists to the region.
The Apollo space program created many new technologies that have been altered for use in everyday life. Fire-resistant textiles that were invented to protect the astronauts from extreme temperatures are now used by firefighters. Other innovations that came as a result of this mission are cellular phones, water purification systems, and insulation. Many important scientific discoveries were made as well. Samples of lunar soil Neil Armstrong gathered on this mission revealed that the moon is made of the same radioactive isotopes that Earth is. This discovery led to the giant impact theory.
The success of the Apollo program established NASA as a reputable institution and guaranteed future funding for research projects such as the International Space Station and the Curiosity rover. However, in recent years, the focus on and funding for NASA has declined, following the easing of Cold War tensions and the shift in America's foreign policy focus.
The fulfillment of President Kennedy's challenge proved to the world that there are no boundaries and forever changed life on Earth. As journalist John Noble Wilford wrote, "Future generations may well regard that moment on July 20th as the most revolutionary and significant time of the entire 20th century."
With 164 days left in the decade, America had made it to the moon.